Abdullah? Abdullah, are you with me? Abdullah, can you hear me? You're muted. Hello? Can you guys hear me? Yes, looks good.
Check, check.
Yes, I can hear Brother Teacher Jawad. Yes,
I can hear Teacher Vera.
good. That's good.
That is good. Yes.
And we have YouTube link. We are live. We are not in practice session, Teacher Jawad. And we can start. Teacher Jawad, you have a message from Marwan Khalifa.
Yes.
Said,
Marwan.
hi, Teacher Jawad.
Assalamualaikum, Marwan. It's good to hear from you.
He's asking him, can he get A+? He graduated, but he wants A+ from you.
Yes, he can, retroactively. I hope he's doing well. Inshallah. It's my eye contact right here. These are nice faces to look at. Well, I answered him over there. Can you hear me? Marwan.
Yes, Marwan says, yes, thanks. Yeah, I'm doing well. How about you? This is becoming.
Thank you, Teacher Vera. Are you doing the intro or? Okay.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We have Teacher Jawad Khan here to talk about the book, Footsteps of the Prophet. And inshallah, we will have a great time tonight. And if you have any questions, please type it into the chat box and we will get to it as soon as we can.
Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Happy to be here tonight, and we welcome everybody who's watching to this three-part series in the footsteps of the Prophet, Tariq Ramadan's book and biography of the Prophet ﷺ. And what we're going to try to do in the three parts is break it down into his reason for writing the book, which we'll talk about in just a second, when so many biographies exist, and then his early life, peace be upon him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and then his later life in Medina. So the first thing that, if you read anything by Tariq Ramadan, who studied philosophy, amongst many other things, is that he always has a reason for why he wrote something and what he wants to accomplish. And he calls this the raison d'etre, and the reason for being. And at the time that In the Footsteps of the Prophet was published in 2007, there was a crisis that was unfolding in Europe and for European Muslims. And the mass migration that happened post-World War II, when European societies had allowed many of the Muslims who had come from now independent countries to come into Europe, there was, after 50 years, 60 years, 70 years, a great deal of Islamophobia within European countries. And so he wanted to address this Islamophobia by answering what it is the central message and ethos of Islam. And he did that through tracing the footsteps of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, from the time before he was a prophet to when he received the divine revelation, and then throughout the 23 years of his prophethood. So Tariq Ramadan, one of the great things that if you pick up a nonfiction book and you know it's going to be a really good book is if the introduction is really good. If the introduction is really good, then you know the nonfiction book is going to be really good, because most of the times we don't read the introduction. So he tries to answer the question about why he wrote the book and for whom the book is intended. And he tries to do something that's extraordinarily difficult. And he approaches three different audiences within the footsteps. And the first audience is people who are new to Islam, who may not know much about the faith. And so he wants to guide those people through the central message and ethos of what makes Islam Islam, aside from the rhetoric that they've heard. And of course, we have rhetoric in Europe, and then rhetoric in the United States and in other places, but he wants them to understand Islam from its roots. And to do that, one has to understand the life of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him. And then the other audience that he has are Muslims who know about the faith, who are familiar with texts, but he wants them to see the biography of the Prophet from a different angle, a different way of being, and one that they haven't usually heard. And when you go through the book and you read through the book, you see this philosophical bent and an explanation of why the things happened the way that they did and the reason for it. And in understanding that, we begin to understand the faith, and we also begin to understand the Prophet ﷺ, peace and blessings be upon him. And then the final audience that he has are people who are new to Islam, who have come to Islam and have accepted Islam, and they want to see Islam from its roots, from the Prophet. If you look at what was happening in Europe at the time that Tariq Ramadan wrote this book, this Islamophobia, this fear of the other, especially with the dwindling population in Europe, and you had Muslims gaining large populations in many of the different countries. And so you had this rhetoric, this right-wing rhetoric, anti-Islamic rhetoric, anti-Muslim rhetoric, and he needed to address that. And it's a little bit different in the United States, because if you look in the United States, the patterns of immigration were different. You had a very lax work visa in Europe at that time. If you look in the United States, 1 out of every 10 physicians in the United States is a Muslim. In the United States, a Muslim is more likely to have a college education than the general public, which is not true in Europe. So there's different patterns of immigration and different realities, but the anti-Islamic sentiments are still there. And that comes from the stereotypes and biases that happen, that are in the general zeitgeist of what is in the media about Muslims. Earlier, if you were here at the Muslim Educational Trust, there's a really great documentary called Real Bad Arabs, where the real is a homophone, R-E-E-L, and it talks about the stereotypes about Muslims. And when you look at those stereotypes and the general stereotypes that encapsulate the core of Islamophobia, Tariq Ramadan, he tries to, in his book, go and give a different understanding for people if they're willing to open themselves up and learn from the beginning. It's very interesting. There's other reason for writing this book. And when Tariq Ramadan, he visited Portland in 2012, and he spoke at the First Unitarian Church in downtown, somebody asked him a very interesting question. And somebody said, you know, Mr. Ramadan, or Dr. Ramadan, now that we have access and knowledge about science, why do we need faith? What's the purpose of faith? We have all our questions answered by science. And so he gave a very interesting answer, and he referenced a great Argentine writer. His name is Luis Borges, who wrote many different books and poems. And Luis Borges, he said something very interesting. And he said that sometimes we can define something and not know what it is. And then sometimes we cannot know what something is, yet define it. And so Tariq Ramadan, he mentions this at that lecture, is that sometimes we have definitions for things, but we can't understand it. And Luis Borges, he gives this example of infinity. We have a definition of infinity, but who can understand something that's infinite? It's not possible. And so science has an explanation for many things, but as Ramadan mentioned, not everything. Many of us here who have gone to the coast and have seen the beach and the ocean, sometimes we've seen it 50 times, 100 times, 150 times. It doesn't matter, because every time you go and you look at it, it causes this inspiration inside of you. And it's beautiful. How can you quantify that scientifically? Or why, if you have a baby and a baby laughs, it makes you smile. And so science can't quantify that. And the same thing that there is with faith. There are things that cannot be quantified by science. And those are the things that are unseen, as mentioned in the Quran in the second chapter in Baqarah, Surah Al-Baqarah. So Ramadan, he gave a very interesting answer. So going into the book, in the Prophet's life, he calls it an invitation to a spirituality that avoids no question and teaches us in the course of events, trials, hardships, and our quest that the true answers to existential questions are more than those given in by the heart than by the intelligence that we can arrive with. And so now is more important than any. If you have seen the statistics of Pew Research and about the Islamophobia that exists, in 2009, there was research done, and in 10 years, in 2011, after 9/11, and there's currently a study that's going on now by Pew Research about feelings and attitudes towards Islam. We had 43% of Americans said that they either had a strongly disfavorable opinion of Islam or somewhat disfavorable. It's 43%, almost half of people. And these could be your neighbors, these could be your supervisors, your classmates, and people, everyone that's there. And this happens because of the rhetoric that's there, that's posed about Islam and who Muslims are, and all the Islamophobic attitudes that are attributed to Islam. But this faith, when you understand it and you look at the life of the Prophet ﷺ, you see this answer to everything. And the older that you grow and the more experience that you have, you understand why it is that the things that happened that the way that they were. Because we know in orthodoxy, in Islamic orthodoxy, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that he chose everything that was going to happen, and what was going to happen, he knew. And then that these 23 years of prophethood were to lay out the foundations for the answers to questions about life, but those have to be sought. And he goes into a very interesting dialogue about this that we'll get into. And so he answers the question, why did I write this when so many biographies of the Prophet exist? And there are so many prophet biographies about the Prophet that exist. And he said his goal is not to write a new biography that sheds new light. Everything that he sources can be found in the books of Hadith. It can be found in the books of Sirah that already exist. But his idea was to explain the reasoning and the connection that we have with today's life. And then many people, when they think about how there are none of those things, for me, that's relevant. That answers the question that Ramadan had in that lecture that he gave at First Unitarian Church, because there's some things that cannot be answered and they need this faith. And he mentions, if for nothing else, the book is incredibly beautifully written. He has a way of writing sentences that are so beautiful. You have to read them multiple times. I've read the book 6-7 times, and still you get surprised by how beautiful some of these sentences are. And if you like to write, you sit there and you think, I could sit for months and not come up with years. I couldn't come up with the line. That's so beautiful. And he mentions that he, peace and blessings be upon him, the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, was a man, yet he acted to transform the world in the light of the revelation. That this man was chosen and inspired by God, but also fully accepted his own humanity, is what makes Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, an example and a guide for the Muslim faithful. And this theme resonates all the way throughout Ramadan's book, that this man, peace and blessings be upon him, transformed the way people thought in his society. And through transforming the way people thought and looked at the world, he was able to transform society. And then those companions, and then the people, the helpers in Medina that we'll talk about in the third lecture, then went on to transform the whole world. And it was because of the way that the things and the way that the world was looked at and the education that the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, received. And then he has an interesting take on the Prophet's essential role. He believes that Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, simply reminds the faithful of God's presence. He initiates them into his knowledge and discloses the initiatory path of spirituality through which he teaches his companions and community that they must transcend the respect and love they have for him in the worship and love they have for him, the worship that they must offer to and ask of their creator. And throughout the book, there is this emphasis on this duality in Islam that you do not find in any other faith system, which is that the individual is at the center of his or her connection with God, and that there is no intermediary in between, that there is no one who has a higher connection than you do that can come in between you and ask for you. People can ask. The Prophet ﷺ, peace and blessings be upon him, of course, did make dua and for others, but we have this one-to-one connection, and that any time that we seek, we can ask in dialogue with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is something that's central, that runs throughout the course of his book. But at the same time that we have this individual connection with God, we also have this responsibility of taking care of one another. So when you look at the pillars of Islam, right, our shahada is that I make it public and have this personal connection. But when I pay my zakat, when I have my communal prayers, when I make my hajj, these are things that we have society's welfare. And in the third lecture, we'll talk about some of the rules that came about, that the Islamic, the society in Medina that was created a safety net for citizens that was not to be emulated again until Europe. After the failures in Europe, after World War I and World War II, that the safety net under the ethos and values of Islam was created in the Medinan society, where people didn't go hungry. That people who were mentally incapacitated, that they couldn't care for themselves, they were taken care of. If you were a widow or an orphan, they were taken care of. And this idea did not happen until so many years later, but this is because our faith created us. And this is something that, as Ramadan mentions, that we need to tell that story. So not only do we have this individual connection, but then we have this community connection that we take care of. And this is part of the beauty of our faith. And then Ramadan, he mentions that the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, was instructed to say in Surah Al-Kahf, say, O Prophet, I am only a man like you, when he was asked the questions about the existence of the hereafter and the other questions that were posed to him. It has been revealed to me that your God is only one God, and that the same revelation also informs the believers for all eternity of the singular status of this messenger, who, while chosen by God, never lost his human qualities. And so Ramadan, he makes this distinction about between being humane being compassionate in times of when you have to be humane when somebody's suffering, but human, he was human. When you look at all the mythos of different societies, right? When you look at the myths of the Greeks, and you look at the myths of the Babylonians, Gilgamesh, or you look at Achilles or Odysseus, or so on and so forth, they don't have human qualities about being human, about being vulnerable, about being sad, about being worried, about being anxious. And so these human qualities, Ramadan says, is that we connect to the Prophet ﷺ. That through this, and through when he was educated by his Lord, and then that he educated his community, that we accept him this way, and that we see that humanity in him, that he wasn't something that was larger than everything else without having anything, but rather that through his human qualities, he still was able to do things, because we know that there were things that he was divinely guided by, and there were other things that he himself did. So he calls us the two dimensions, the prophet's humanity and the prophet's exemplarity. The prophet's humanity, the quality of being human, and then his exemplariness, that about his generosity, about his kindness, about his willingness to forgive, about his willingness to let go of his ego, and then see himself as this individual that has been guided by his Lord. Now, Ramadan, he makes a very interesting point that throughout the book, he talks about how the Prophet ﷺ, peace and blessings be upon him, has to manage his ego. And then he lets go of his ego. And he mentions that every single person that exists has a web of connections. So every single one who's watching, and everyone in this room, you are a daughter or a son or a husband or a wife or a brother or a sister or a grandparent or a grandson. You are a commuter with other people. You are a shopper, and there's someone who's checking out your groceries. You have these connections. You are an employee or you are an employer. And every single one of these connections that we have expectations of how they should behave towards us. I want my spouse to treat me in a certain way, not only based on the rights that I have, but I want them to treat me in a certain way. I want my friend to treat me in a certain way. And when I don't get that certain way, it causes me anxiety. And it causes me suffering, because we want to have this influence on people. And Ramadan, he talks about this with the Prophet ﷺ, with his uncle and his grandfather, and that he wants them to believe in a certain way. But he also says, all of us, we have this. I want my friend to treat me in a certain way. I want this person to talk to me in this certain way. And when they don't, and I can't control that, it creates that in me. Then my ego gets hurt. And that centralness. But then Ramadan, he also goes on to say that he knows that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows that because he created us, and that he's closer to us than our jugular vein. So he knows that my ego wants to do that. And then so this was the education that the Prophet ﷺ received, because he wanted certain people to behave a certain way. Not because his ego did it, because he wanted them to accept the truth. But there's only so much you can do. And the only thing that we can control is what's in our hands. And then sometimes people will react to us in a certain way that we can't control, no matter what we do, no matter what it is that we say, how we look, how we approach them, they will not accept that. And then I can't control that. But then my insistence on keeping on that, because my nafs talks to me, and he goes on a tangent on this in his first chapter, in his introduction. My nafs makes me want to say, no, I will make them do this. But it doesn't. And then so that gap between my expectation and reality causes disappointment. And then we can linger on that disappointment, or then we can understand that people move on. And then he goes on to mention also that this is what causes between people grudges, when we hold on to those grudges. and that we can't seem to move on beyond that. But then this instruction that the Prophet ﷺ received from, as Ramadan mentioned, is to move on to that, and that what he can control, that he can only be an initiator to the spirituality. But you can't control anybody. You can't control how anybody receives you. So his initial idea, he says about this in his Razan Datur, is that to plunge into the Prophet's life and draw out its teachings. And he says the adherence to faith, dialogue with God, observing nature, self-doubt, inner peace, signs and trials are themes that speak to us, remind us that basically nothing has changed. The life of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, points to primary and eternal as existential questions. And he approaches this doubt extremely well, that he doesn't see that the doubt, and he talks about this in chapter 1 with the Prophet Ibrahim, and he has one of his best chapters when he talks about Prophet Ibrahim. It's extraordinarily interesting, and I'll try to summarize this here as we move on. But about the fact that nobody is going to go without doubt, and that doubt is not a weakness because they come into our minds. And then he mentions that if we do have doubt, and then he talks about this in the story of Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam and his two trials with Hajar and Ismail. I'll be pleased with them, and then with Ismail as well. That this doubt that comes in happens with our faith, because our faith is not static, and then our faith is like the tides, that the tides sometimes come in, they flow, and then you're full of iman, and then everything makes sense, and then sometimes things happen, and then we're not, and then it waxes, right? It wanes, it goes back, and it flows back in. But what he says, and when he tells about the story we'll get to about Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam, is that if you do have that doubt, and you feel that waning, then there are signs for you to go in and have that iman rebuilt. And so there's two ways that you can look at it. One is that if you do have doubts, then you look for every single piece of doubt that makes me not believe, and I'll look for that. Or that I have this faith that this is the truth because I've accepted it. Now, not everything can make 100% sense. That's what faith is. You can't have every single thing make sense, because if it did, then that wouldn't be faith. You take that leap of faith and you believe in something, and then some things aren't going to be exactly clear, but then you look for the answers, because there are answers. And when we discuss Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam in a second, he talks about that beautifully. And he also mentions that studying the Prophet his actions in the historical and geographical setting should enable us to throw light on a number of principles about the relation of faith to human beings, brotherhood, love, adversity, community life, justice, laws, in both judicial settings, in political settings, in a philosophical setting, in a social setting, in a cultural setting, all of these things. And he talks beautifully, and we'll talk about this in the second lecture, he talks beautifully about how faith came then, and about how it's different, because if you are born into a Muslim family, you learn most of the time, most people, they learn about the requirements and the movements before the spirituality. And so for the Prophet ﷺ, it was the spirituality. He was out in the desert. He was out even before the message came, when they were sent outside with the Bedouins to learn pure Arabic and to learn the other aspects growing up. And they looked up at the sky, and he has this beautiful line. And if you look throughout the Quran, and then when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions about, have you seen, have you thought about, have you reflected upon, but that sky, Ramadan writes about beautifully, was so different. Because when you look up at the sky in the desert, just full with stars and brightness, and you realize that Ramadan says that you are such a tiny little portion. My ego says I'm at the center of the world because that's how I survive. But when you look up and you realize you have all these stars and you have a planet that's spinning around the sun, that's spinning around the solar system, that's spinning around the galaxy, that's spinning around other galaxies, you realize about the smallness of yourself, the tininess of yourself, and you understand your place. And so through this is a different approach. You don't learn the movements first of the prayer. You have that spirituality. And so when sometimes young people ask why, we'll say, okay, yeah, because you have to do this. But there's a reason why that happened. And that reason why gives the impetus for understanding that need for that faith and answers those questions. And so when you have a deep dive into Islam and the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ, you begin to understand some of these things. And so, working with students, for example, a lot of them will say, well, why do you have these boundaries? Why are these boundaries on you? But what they don't realize is that everyone has boundaries of some sort. And the only way to get rid of those boundaries is that when you have a complete faith in God, then you don't have any shackles. Nothing matters. Because what you think and what someone else thinks, it doesn't matter anymore. And so when people think that there are boundaries, we know that because we accepted that this is divinely sent down, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created the system of boundaries that I can't exceed. He's given it to me. I accept that. There must be a reason why. And so when everyone is young, you understand why. Well, why can't I do this? And why can't I do that? It's because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us and He knows us and closer to us than our own jugular vein. So He knows why we do the things that we do. And then why, when our nafs whispers to us, why it's so overpowering and we want to do it, even though we know it's wrong. And then we fall into error, and then we recover from that error and ask for forgiveness, and then we continue. And he ends his introduction and he talks about the deep love. And it's one of the reasons why, and this is one of the parts of Islamophobia that gets exaggerated when there is something that's said about the Prophet ﷺ, when there's something drawn about the Prophet ﷺ, and when it goes against the mores and values of Islam, and people, it gets used as, okay, look at these people in the middle of the street yelling and causing violence about why this happened, why are they saying this, why can't I draw a cartoon, why can't I say anything, free speech, so on and so forth. But Ramadan, he talks about this deep love that the companions and then we have for the Prophet ﷺ. And he says in Surah Al-Imran, in the closest meaning, if you love Allah, follow me, the Prophet ﷺ. Allah will love you. And then he tells the story, and we'll talk about this again in the third lecture, that when Umar, may Allah be pleased with him, heard of the Prophet ﷺ's death, he threatened to hurt or kill whoever dared to claim that the Prophet ﷺ was dead. But his grief was not of a violent grief. It was because Umar, may Allah be pleased with him, he understood that this divine guidance and answers to questions was now going to leave. In Ramadan, he mentions, as we'll talk about in the end of the second lecture and the third lecture, about the laws and regulations of how to run a society. They weren't all created and sent down under the Prophet ﷺ. Many of them came under Abu Bakr and Umar, may Allah be pleased with them, in the first Khalifa and the second Khalifa. But they weren't divinely sent. They were an understanding of the guiding principles. And so one of the things that Ramadan he does is he says people understand that the law people think of as static. There are some things that are static, but there's ways of interpretation. This goes into some of the things that Ramadan has run into. Ramadan's very interesting because he gets attacked from both sides. He gets attacked from people who are considered on the extreme right or the conservative end. And he says, well, there's some things you can't say. This can't be interpreted this way. And then he gets attacked by people who say, no, he doesn't go far enough. And then he gets attacked also by people in power in Europe and the United States. And so it's very interesting. So he's probably doing something right, that he's getting attacked by everybody, but he's going to make you think. And if you read this book, or if you read A Quest for Meaning, or What I Believe, or his most intellectual work, Radical Reform, you understand this incredibly philosophical and intelligent argument about placing things and about the things that are talked about in the public rhetoric and debate about what are the central tenets and ethos and values of Islam or of any other faith. And then he goes on to say, but Abu Bakr, may Allah be pleased with him, said, O you people, let those who worship Muhammad know that Muhammad is now dead. And as for those who worship Allah, let them know that Allah is ever living and does not die. And that this verse from Surah Imran showed that Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, was a messenger, the one who was the initiator to the path to this faith. And that many messengers who were passed away before him, if he died or was killed, will you then turn back? And that's what separates the Prophet ﷺ. He came, he gave this message, but he was a human being. And through those human being frailties, he still extended beyond. That's why we have this personal love for the Prophet ﷺ, who's so the best of creation ever, but yet still had these human qualities, as we'll see when the message first came to him. In his first chapter, Ramadan, he sets up this encounter with, he sets up before when the revelation comes to the Prophet ﷺ. And then he has this beautiful recurring theme that threads through the whole book about the Prophet ﷺ, peace and blessings be upon him, and his look at the way what life is, and about when he received that education when he was out in the desert. And so many things happened, as we'll go through them, about the loss of the people who were close to him and the year of sorrow, and then how he was to make it through that, and that life itself is fleeting and ephemeral and evanescent, and that it's not lasting, and that when someone has an understanding of that, it doesn't get entrenched into that and then holds on to something that's not going to last, and holding on to something that's going to only cause them pain. But releasing of that, this thread throughout the book, it's about how to overcome that ego and to replace that ego with an understanding of self and one's place in the universe. He does so eloquently in this book, and if nothing else, that'll be one of the best parts of it. Now, he has, before he gets into the life of the Prophet ﷺ, he talks about Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam. And in his introduction to Prophet Ibrahim, he says that this prophet and his lineage, of course, directly related to the Prophet ﷺ, he talks about a trial of faith. And then that he relates this trial of faith to everybody. And he explains so beautifully in his book. There's so many different lines that we can read from here. But the trial that happens between what happens to Hajar and Ismail, salam, that when they were left alone in the valley, and then that they had to accept that. And he mentions incredibly that this is the same that everybody has through his or her own life. And we know that through the narration of Sayyid Bukhari about what happened with when Hajar and Ismail were left, and that Hajar, she asked Ibrahim where they were left, and then that when she's told that that Prophet Ibrahim, it's because it's a command from God. In Ramadan, he says that she asked, then trusted, then accepted. She asked, then trusted, then accepted. And by doing so, she traced the steps of the profound active acceptance of God's will, to question with one's mind, to understand with one's intelligence, and to submit with one's heart. That's with everything. Why did this happen? Or how come we have to do this? Or this is the case. And that this active three-step process to ask and to trust and to accept, to question with one's mind, to understand with one's intelligence, and then submit in one's heart, that this is the active acceptance of God's will, that it was meant to be this way, and that nothing that I could have done, it was meant to be. As the great scholar Ibn Qayyim says, Allah have mercy on his soul, that what's meant for you will reach you even if it lays beneath the mountains. And what's not meant for you won't reach you even if it lays between your two lips. But it's hard to accept that, because as a human, we want to challenge that and think that we can. And we do with our own active free will. But that free will also comes with understanding that this was meant to be. And then I accept that. And then when I accept that, then I'm freed from my burden of anxiety and loss. I accept that. Then I can have some peace, but that's extraordinarily difficult, as Ramadan mentions, to do that. And then he gives a very interesting explanation of what happens with Prophet Ibrahim and alayhi salam and his active acceptance. And he mentions that in the great trial that we read about in Surah Al-Safat, when Ismail, he says, "O my father, do as you are commanded, you will find me if God so wills one of the steadfast." So he had this trial where he had to sacrifice his own son. And he makes this incredible observation. See, when we learned this story, all of us learned it as kids, right? But Ramadan, he looks at it a little bit differently. And he says that when you learned it as a kid, most people said, well, you had to accept it. And he accepted it. But he says, Ramadan, there's something more. And he says that Ibrahim alayhi salam may have doubted himself that he could do it. But he was never alone, because Ismail alayhi salam, he was there with them. And they were together. The commandment came to both of them. He makes a very interesting observation that if you read in the book of Genesis, in the Bible, Abraham, he makes that the command comes to him. And in the Bible, it's Isaac, Ishaq, that is being sacrificed, not Ismail. And then so Isaac asked, where's the burnt offering going to be? But the command comes just to Abraham, and he's alone. And Ramadan, he makes this very interesting observation about Western tragedy and Western philosophy, about this need for this solitary approach to finding something. And that he was alone, Ibrahim was alone. But here, he's with Ismail, who's saying, do as God commanded. And so, Tariq Ramadan, he mentions that we find that when we question that there are signs everywhere that lead us to faith. And I can look for those signs. And I can actively look for those signs. And if I actively look for those signs, then my faith renews and it waxes. Right? It comes in, it flows. But then when I don't look, it wanes and it flows out. And for Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam, he might have had, as Tariq Ramadan says so beautifully, he educates Ibrahim in faith. Ibrahim doubts himself and his own strength and faith, but at the same time, the signs prevent him from doubting God. This teaches Ibrahim humility and recognition of the Creator. When Ibrahim is tempted by deep doubt about himself, his faith in the truth of what he hears and understands, the inspirations and confirmations of Hajar and Ismail, whom he loves but sacrifices the name of divine love, enable him not to doubt God, his presence and his goodness. Doubt about self. And he makes this amazing sentence. He writes this amazing sentence. Doubt about self is thus allied to deep trust in God. If I doubt myself, where am I going to go? If I doubt myself, whom I know better than anybody else? All my thoughts that are in there. If I'm going to doubt myself, then I have to trust something else, someone else. And that's the connection Tariq Ramadan makes, that doubt in self is related to deep trust in God. I'm getting how many more minutes? 2 minutes? 1 minute. 1 minute? Okay. It's he finishes this chapter when he makes the connection about the one-to-one connection, and he talks about how in Islam the trials of faith aren't ever tragic. Sometimes they're tragic in other faith traditions, but in Islam they're never tragic. And for example, this story, if you read in the book of Genesis, the story of Abraham and Hajar and Isaac and Ismail, Sarah tells Abraham to leave because she's upset at Ismail who said something to Isaac. But in Islam, we don't have that. It's never tragic like that because that's tragic. And in Islam, the trials are never tragic. So he ends with that. He also makes, if you're interested, a very interesting philosophical argument between the great Danish philosopher Kierkegaard. He wrote a book called Fear and Trembling. It's about Prophet Ibrahim's trial, and then he connects it, which is actually very interesting if you're interested in that. All right. Question and answers then. Stop right there.
So, Assalamu alaikum, brother. I just had a question on why is it that in the book of Genesis, it is more of a tragic event with Sarah being upset at the sequence of events, as opposed to in the Quran, it is more of, it's just a matter of fact.
Yes. So are you asking what Ramadan says about that, or?
Yes, I am.
Yeah. So yeah, that's what Ramadan is saying is that the trials of faith, they aren't tragic in the fact that you have this happen why Hajar and Ismail were in this valley, and that when they were running low on everything, we had the miracle that we know from Sahih Bukhari, when they drank from the waters of Zamzam, that the story in the book of Genesis is tragic in the fact that Prophet Abraham has to face this alone. But the whole reason for their exile was not because of a trial of faith, but because of a person being upset, which is very human in that. And so he makes the delineation between the two. And then so he makes a brief, he doesn't go into a deep exegesis, he goes into a brief one about how on one hand you have here a tragedy of someone being exiled because someone feels upset that this other child is being treated this way by this other child. Whereas in the Quranic one, it is a trial of faith that has been sent down, and that Ibrahim alayhi salam accepts, approaches Hajar, who asks him why, but then mentions is this been divinely ordained, and Ibrahim says yes, and then she accepts. And then that this trial then, instead of one being tragic, is one that's instructive, and then for us, which is then as Ramadan, he mentions a metaphor for our own, that something will happen. We have a trial of faith, and then if we accept it, and then after we accept it, then we can be at peace with it, regardless of what it is. Nobody here will ever have something as a trial to go and to leave the wife and a child into a barren valley. And for sure, nobody will ever have a trial that says that you have to sacrifice a son that you loved and that you longed for and you waited so long to have. So we have other trials that are probably lesser, but the active acceptance of it allows us to then have that deep faith, the type of faith that moves mountains, the type of faith that changed society. The core group that was in Mecca that had the tutelage, I will learn about 170, and then in Medina, they changed the world not through cultural faith, but through this deep faith of everything. So he makes that distinction that it's never tragic, a trial in Islam, but always instructive and then brings us closer.
Brother Khan, much appreciated on that answer.
You're welcome, sir.
Assalamu alaikum.
Salam.
Thank you for a beautiful presentation. The question I have is like the society we live in today, like especially in the United States. We live is a secular society, a lot of Muslim and a lot of non-Muslim. So what are the qualities that the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam in his time used to be able like to live in those kind of society where like, you know, you have a lot of Muslim and non-Muslim. So, and we're going through a lot of those kind of issues here. So what are the qualities that he was, you know, presenting so to allow him to live and be an example for a lot of people at that time?
No, I mean, you know, you have, it's very interesting. We have this discussion all the time, is that we have in every society, in his society at that time, Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, in every society, there are elements that we don't like or that we want to stay away from, but that's everywhere. But yet here we are talking freely about the Prophet ﷺ, and we get to broadcast it, and everyone has a Zoom link, can watch it, and we can say and we can ask questions. So we also have this great amount of freedom to practice our faith. And we have in every society, you can see something, and even if societies that sometimes people say are Islamic or Muslim societies, we see other things as well. But one of the things that binds us, our strength, is in our community. And then we see in many other communities as well, they may not be Muslim communities, but there are other communities they also have this ties of brotherhood. And we see that goodness that are there, and we gravitate towards that. In the next session that we have, there's a great story that Ramadan, he goes in depth about the Hifd al-Fudul, the pact of the virtuous, in which he discusses about the Prophet ﷺ and Abu Bakr attending a meeting that happened before revelation came down. And the Prophet ﷺ talks about it afterwards. And this was a group between the chieftains. They were deciding about how to stop the internecine wars that they had and the conflicts that they had, because they were tired of it. And so the Prophet ﷺ, he said something very interesting and is very instructive for how we look at things today. And he said that even if today, if I were invited to that, and this is after revelation had come down, I would still go, about how to make something right for goodness, which gives us an understanding that if somebody is doing something good, whether, people first started blood drives, and you can read about the history about blood drives, about the fatwas about blood drive, and can you donate blood and these type of things, or organ transplants. So there's this good that happens, and we gravitate towards that good wherever it is, and we find that good. And when it's not, even when it's within the Muslim community or the other community, we have an active duty that we bring the good, we advise, and then if nothing else, then we separate ourselves from that. But we know very well what it is that we do and then where we go towards.
My beloved brother Jawad, what a beautiful reflections and great understanding. I just want to applaud my dear beloved brother Bo Qudsi from the greater Los Angeles area. We would love to have you as a speaker, brother Bo. Thanks for engaging with us, and thanks to all the audience that are online. We have 100 and something, in all the platforms. Brother Bo, would you take the challenge and give us your wisdom sometime in the near future?
Me and Brother Wajdi, in fact, I'll be joining you guys, inshallah, in January. But I'd like to take this discussion offline, as you probably saw.
Right.
Let's give a round of applause to our dear beloved teacher Jawad. Next session is next Thursday. This book will, reflections will run in 3 weeks. Next session is Thursday, November the 11th at 6:30 Pacific Standard Time. Again, thank you very much, Teacher Jawad, and thanks to everybody that attended today live and online platforms. Thank you.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.